When most people think back to their childhood, they think about homemade meals, mom hugging you, playing outside with fireflies, and maybe even Easter egg hunts. And you look back on those memories very fondly. When I think back to my childhood, I think about the sad and scared little girl that was shoved into cages, that was ritually abused, and that spent 13 years fighting for her life and in complete terror. I also think of the little girl that spent 7 years underground in a military base. That's what I think about when I think about my childhood. Today we're going to be talking about specifically that childhood, that little girl, and how everything that happened to her came to be. Today we're going to be talking about my full story end to end of how I entered into satanic ritual abuse and ended up living in an underground base for almost 13 years. Welcome back to Angel's Journey Podcast. Hi, welcome. If you're new here, hi, my name is Angel. I'm a satanic ritual abuse survivor, government-sponsored mind control survivor, and former occultist turned Christian. So welcome to my channel. If you're new, if you feel like it, hit that bell, subscribe, do all the things, share with your friends if you want. But here on my account, I specifically talk about suffering from satanic ritual abuse, as well as living underground in a military base until I was age 13. So if you like that kind of stuff, if you like conspiracy theory, occult, cults themselves, weird creatures, how the supernatural realm actually works, you should stick around. Today's podcast style, I'm not going to do much editing, so this is definitely an episode that you can have on in the background. Highly encourage you. Just put your phone up and just take a listen. We're going to get into how I went underground and all that stuff, but first I have to lay the groundwork as to how I even got involved in this stuff in the first place, because unlike most survivors, my parents were not a part of the occult. I have a very close friend who is the granddaughter of Anton LaVey and the great-great-granddaughter of Aleister Crowley, and her non-bio parents, she was adopted, were very much involved in this, as well as her bio parents. Okay, so that is not my story. So my story is unique in this way. And there's a lot of other survivors that it's their uncle, it's their cousin. But my fourth or fifth cousin, Nathan Reynolds, we are both from the same Reynolds bloodline. He talks about how his parents were involved in it. Now, his parents had much more money than my family. I think we were kind of the runts of the Reynolds clan, maybe, I don't know. So if my parents were involved in this, how did this happen? How did this work? Well, my maternal grandmother and her husband, who was my step grandfather, he was not my biological grandfather. And so they were a part of a group called the Rosicrucians. Now, I was just speaking to you about my cousin Nathan Reynolds, and I want to make something clear that not only were they part of this cult, I am also a descendant of one of the 13 original families. And so just like Nathan talks about, my bloodline is known for being from the line of Nimrod. And they have heavy documentation to speak about that. It's kind of funny. People have even said in TikTok videos that I look like Nathan. So we have the same, I have makeup on, but we have the same nose. We definitely have the same eye color, gray, very gray eyes, and kind of darkish, reddish hair. So interesting. We do look the same. When I was blonde, we didn't look the same at all, but now we do. So anyway, so the Reynolds were one of the original 13 families. So we have a very volatile mix going on. I was in editing and I realized I forgot to tell this story. So something else to give you an idea of the high strangeness that was in my family. My grandmother had told my family a very strange story about when she stumbled upon her father in the middle of the night. My great-grandfather, who was the bio father of my biological grandmother, was a high-level sorcerer, as luck would have it. And one night, she was stumbling out of her bedroom, and she found her father in the middle of the room, levitating on a black obsidian-looking like throne with all manners of colors swirling around him. And he looked at her and said, "You have the gift too, sister." Sorcery and witchcraft has been passed down in my family for generations, for a long time. And I am the first one that I know of to break the cycle. And so for those of you that don't know, the original 13 families are the 13 families that made deals with Lucifer ages ago. And there is actually a paper on CIA.gov. I'll put a reference for the title of it here. It's by Fritz Springmeier, and they actually put this dude in fucking prison for publishing this paper because he did all this research on the original 13 families, okay? And these 13 families have now splintered into other last names. And so that's where the Reynolds come from specifically. So we are a descendant of one of the original 13. And then, of course, my step-grandfather was heavily involved in Rosicrucianism. Okay. What is Rosicrucianism? Rosicrucianism is a study of the esoteric and alchemical practices. Now, just like the Masons, they present as a group, a fraternus, a fraternitas, as they say in Latin. But they are not what they seem, because when you start getting up higher level in the rose, a lot of them, you have to be a 33rd degree Mason before you even attempt to become a Rose. And there obviously, there's people that comment like, Angel, my dad was in the Rosicrucians and he was like a level 1. I'm talking about a different path. That is the path of the level 1, level 2 Mason that stages out towards the public where nobody sees what's going on the inside. I'm talking about high-level Rosicrucianism, high-level Masonic lodge, okay? Scottish Rite. That's what I'm talking about. Rosicrucians kind of branched off from the Scottish Rite. And if you want to hear more about this from an actual member, you guys should look up Bill Schneblin on YouTube. He's still alive. God love him. He's amazing. He did all these things. He was a lycanthrope, so he was a vampire at one point, survived off of blood for like several years, which I like to point you guys to these people because it attests to my story that there are real people alive out there that have experienced these things themselves. So anyway, but he talks about being a Mason, being a Rosicrucian, being a Mormon. He talks about all these things. Okay. So my grandfather was a high level Rosicrucian. And so there were two folds, and there was a side of the occult, but also a mix of the government sponsored mind control programs like MK Ultra. Okay. So I'll share my birth story with you all, but something before my birth story you should know is that my birth was planned for over 100 years. And I want you to understand what that means. What that means is that when people are born in the occult, it's rarely by accident. And Dan Duvall, I have my feelings about him, but he is a very well intellectualized person and well-known person in the space, and has some pretty incredible interviews on his channel. I don't like hearing him talk, but I love hearing the survivors talk that he interviews. So Dan Duvall talks about iniquity in the bloodline. And he talks about, and he's right, he talks about how iniquity can be built up in a bloodline over decades, centuries, and years. And so that is why when someone like myself and Nathan Reynolds is born, it is a big deal because they have spent decades of abusing certain people in your bloodline to ensure the demonic and number one, the demonic power, the Nephilim spirit power, and the iniquity that runs through their veins continues to pass through you. And why is that? Because what these people do to you, if you don't have a high level of iniquity, you won't fucking make it. You will die. I watched so many children die underground because they could not take it. They could not deal with it. It is not necessarily a compliment that I was able to survive it. There is a reason I was able to survive it, and it's because they planned my birth for so many years. And when you build up that iniquity in the bloodline, when the child is born, they are born in darkness. And Batman and Bane talks about, your shadows belong to me because you knew the dark. You became familiar with the dark, but Bane was born in it. And that is how that's how survivors are born. They are born with 20 legs up in the wrong direction. They're 20 legs down, essentially. Instead of having a leg up on someone, they have 20 legs down because it's so much darkness that they are born into. But the occult loves that because what that means is that your occult power is going to be incredibly intense. And so for the sake of this example, I just want you to understand that the reason for my 100-year planned birth is because they knew, okay, we're eventually going to have a son or a daughter be born, and they are going to have enough occult power to do these certain things that they want them to do. And so I have no doubt that if my grandparents had continued to live, that I would have been trained for Hollywood for sure. I would have been I would have been famous. And their plans were 100% interrupted. But I just want you to understand that there was always a plan in place of what I was to become and what I was going to be. Okay, so with that in mind, they've planned my birth. My grandmother was obviously programmed, probably her mothers and fathers before that, and their spouses were pre-planned. They never met anyone by accident, and they knew that someone would eventually be born that they could have them endure certain rituals that they needed them to. So my birth story is interesting, the way my parents tell it. So it's 1996. I'm 30 years old. My mother is going into labor. And strangely, my father has come down with the flu, a really heavy case of the flu, which, now looking back, just screams witchcraft in my opinion. But, they didn't know any better because my grandparents had Christian altars that would, play the part and would, for a lack of a better term, it would disguise, the Christian altars would disguise their occult parts, basically. And so my father was horribly sick with the flu. Sorry, I'm just annoyed by my hair right now. My father was sick with the flu, and my mother was under the impression that she was going to be able to give natural birth and not have a C-section, and so ended up needing a C-section. And my grandmother was in there the entire time because my dad was sick. He was just kind of sitting up against the wall, just trying to stay alive because he had like 103 fever. Well, when I was born, the first person to hold me was not my mom, it was my grandmother. And I've been told two different stories. I've been told, oh, your mom, then your grandmother. It doesn't really matter, but why would you not? I understand my father is sick, but why would you not hand me to my father with some type of medical equipment on? And so the point is that my grandmother held me, and that is when I was first initiated into the occult, whether you understand that or not. Because when these people get their hands on you, they begin to curse you, channel things to you, and begin to mark you. That's why it's very important who you allow into your birth room, who you allow around your children when they are first born. The first thing that's going to happen to my children is before they set my child on my chest, they are going to hand it to my husband, because my husband is going to consecrate them to God and tell them that they are the Lord's before they go on my chest, because he is the head of my home. And medical professionals would disagree with you. That's, fine, but that's what I would want spiritually. And so you passing around your newborn baby to everybody, culturally, we think that's normal, but it's really not. You need to be asking God who needs to be touching your child and in the beginning stages, and who doesn't. So at that point, when I was an infant, there were, what I believe, doctors that were a part of this same cult. And they took my DNA. And they were able to clone me. And I know that sounds crazy, and that's fine, but I have the physical implications to back this up. And when they cloned me, at some point, I was switched out as an infant. At some point. Don't know when. This is a very common thing that happens with SRA survivors. And so when they switched me out, I was immediately put in an artificial womb and was birthed pretty shortly after. And so my parents had the real me at some point, and they swapped me. So my grandparents and the occult, and eventually government people that were involved, they eventually switched me, and my parents took home a clone, and I stayed with my grandparents. And I have to be careful. I stayed with the military and eventually lived underground for 13 years. Okay, so that is how I was taken away from my parents. And it also is why my story is hard to corroborate, because there's pictures of me as a child with my parents, but yet I have all these memories of being underground and all this trauma in my body of being sexually assaulted and raped all the time. And there's no explanation for it. And I had no understanding as to how this could be possible until cloning was brought up. And I remember the process of being cloned, and it is excruciating. No matter what people tell you, it's excruciating. It's traumatizing. It's not this simple thing that people make it out to be. It's horrible. So my parents took home the clone. So we're going to put a pin in that for now. And now we're going to talk about me being an infant, being raised by my grandparents. So I mostly lived in their basement up until I was about 6 or 7. When I was 6, I was then transferred to a military base in the South underground that was decommissioned, essentially, okay? And that's where I lived. And I want you to think of 11 and Stranger Things. I had a bed, I had a room, I had a toilet, I had some stuffies, and I had some clothes. And that's where I lived. And I had neighbors, I had some roommates, and there were other kids down there. Totally normal. Totally, completely normal. The scientists and the officials that were down there thought that they were studying extra special children. And so I don't know what they thought, like, where the fuck are these children's parents? I don't know why that wasn't thought of, but to them, it was completely normal. So let's talk about ages like infant, newborn to 6 years old, because that's strictly living with my grandparents. So my grandmother was obviously DID. And to explain how my grandmother was, it's very difficult because there were sides of her that were obviously her kind alters and her loving alters. And so I do have some fond memories of her, but they are pieces of her. They're not the whole her, because most of her was incredibly dark. She never abused me, but she never stopped it from happening. So I mostly lived in their basement, and there are very specific rituals that have to occur in order for you to move on in the next stage of programming. And you can look into this, but most of the carving out of your consciousness has to happen between the ages 0 and 7. Otherwise, if you don't do it right into those years, those in between years, right there, 0 to 7, they will remember sooner than what they need you to. And there's something called the amnesiac barrier of the brain. And my husband talks about it in his book that he wrote about deprogramming me, because my husband is the one who helped deprogram me, which we'll talk about in another video. But it's called The Bloody One by DTChildress. That's his pen name. You can get it on Amazon. It's pretty cheap. But it's called the amnesiac barrier of the brain. And usually that starts to break down at about 30. Now, what they did to me was so horrific. My programming started breaking down at about 24, 25. So I've roughly been maybe 26. So I've been healing for almost 4 years now. Now, those original years are some of the most traumatizing things that you could do to a child. I remember being an infant, and I was placed on an altar somewhere in the woods, and they were sexually assaulting a 9-month-old. I want you to understand that. These people are sick. They are fucking sick and need to be locked up, because my family is just one of many that do this to children. Okay. And already as an infant, you begin to split, because God did not design us to endure that level of trauma and keep it. I already have fibromyalgia from the level of trauma that I have still got and am having, and like what they did to me. If we, so this is where DID comes in, and people get confused because they're like, how does that happen? The splitting of consciousness, which is also the splitting of the soul, happens when someone experiences trauma to the point that is so severe. A alter is then your consciousness splits and your brain fragments off in these personalities, because you need someone else to help take and bear the pain. And the rest of your consciousness is not aware of the pain that's happening. That way, you don't die. If you didn't split, you would die, because we were not made to endure that type of trauma. And so there are normal people that have been sexually assaulted that are walking around with a couple fragments is what I call them. People that aren't severe DID, they get something called fragments. You can look up Steve Harmon and understand on YouTube what are fragments, what are altars, and how they differ, and like how normal people can have them. My husband had a few fragments that we dealt with from trauma. And sorry, I do have a vocal fry, specifically just because I screamed a lot when I was a child, and including in this body. So just please be kind about that. I'm not trying to do a vocal fry. It's just how I talk. And so that was my first memory of being on an altar. And so that was the start of 6 years of consistent ritual abuse. And ritual abuse is where they have you in satanic rituals. And there were famous people in this state that my grandfather was in, who is a Grammy award winner in entertainment, is what I will say. And they would come over and be a part of the rituals. And some of the stuff that he produced was in the Christian realm. So people thought he was this amazing Christian. Meanwhile, rituals were going on in his basement. And so at a certain point, at about 6 years old, is when the cages start to come in. And I was able to endure a lot of the rituals and a lot of the memories the Lord has just taken because they were so awful to have around, that you don't want to walk around with memories of you being assaulted at 3 or 4 years old. Nope, nobody needs to carry that around. And so the Lord is good, and he takes those things. I saw them for what they were, and once I had processed that fragment or that altar, he pretty much took most of the memory with it, which I appreciate. That was a gift. It was a gift. So at about 6 or 7 years old, you get to the stage of where they need you hooked on blood. Because we're not supposed to do that according to the Bible, right? That's not what we're supposed to do. And so the cages are a very specific type of programming. And lots of SRA people will talk to you about the cages. Because when you think of a cage, what's normally in a cage? An animal. You put an animal in a cage. You would never think to put a child in a cage. Well, what if you wanted the child to think it was no better than an animal? What if you wanted that child to get down to its base instinct and be subhuman beneath the people that are programming you? That's why you would put a child in a cage. And that's what they did. And so there were things that they made me do in this cage that I am not going to go into detail because it is traumatizing. But I want you to understand that I split very hard in that cage. And in my deprogramming, there was an altar that I had that would come forward, and she would be the one to do the things that they asked to do in the cage. And after the cage, it took weeks. I refused for weeks to do what they wanted me to do. And if you want to know what I do, just go buy my husband's book. He talks about it in there. I'm not going to talk about it on YouTube. I'm not. After weeks of starvation, I finally succumbed. And I just said, whatever. I also couldn't die. So I was waiting for death to come, but death never did. And the Bible talks about that. And I fully believe in Revelation, people will have Nephilim DNA in them and all this stuff, and they're going to want to wish they were dead, and they're not going to be able to be dead because I was so controlled by these things that I wasn't allowed to die. They weren't done yet. They weren't going to let my soul go. They were like, no, we need you. So miraculously, I survived for like a month without food and like sips of water. For a child, that is almost impossible. It's not an adult's body. And so eventually I succumbed, and it was at that moment that I was then taken in the car and I was transferred to a underground military base, and I underwent my initiation into being kept underground. All right. So, underground. Underground, when you first get there, it's kind of like checking into prison. Like, you kind of walk in, you're a child, there's a designated area for you. They're taking your belongings, which is normally like, next to nothing. They then, give you these clothes with a number on it, like prison. And then you eventually are taken to your new, I don't even want to call it a home. I just call it a hole in which you're going to live for the next 8 years. I was there until I was 13. And I want you to understand that I want to emphasize that every day of your existence is exhausting. It's exhausting. From 6 until 13, so roughly, I guess, 7 years. For 7 years, all of my days included training of some kind, torture of some kind, body swapping, consciousness transfer, and missions. All kinds of missions. We will get into missions another day, but the important thing to know is from 6 until 13, that is where I was. Now, if you remember, there is a clone with my parents that is living with them at the same time as I'm having this experience underground, which I know sounds absolutely insane. I didn't believe it either until I started having physical manifestations of these things. That's where we're going to leave it today. The next video, I will get into my near-death experience, how I escaped the underground, and how I ended up back in my body above ground. And so that's a really different story in itself, but I wanted to explain how I became a ritual abuse survivor and how I ended up underground. So thanks for sticking around. I hope you had a good time and love you guys. See you in the next one.